Because my parents named me James at birth, I spent 3 years of high school answering to the name Santiago, a name given me by a Spanish teacher who called her students by the Spanish version of our English names. Unsophisticated in the ways of language, I didn't understand the connection between the word James and Santiago, so I took my curiosity to the Google of my day, the World Book Encyclopedia. There, I learned that Santiago was a combination of two words, sant, saint or holy, and Iago, the Arabic-influenced Spanish for Jacob or Jacob, the Latin name that's translated James in English. So Santiago literally means Saint James. It was also in that encyclopedia article that I first read about Saint James' connection to the Iberian Peninsula. He's the patron saint of Spain. Reading further, I took particular interest in the Camino de Santiago, a millennium-old pilgrimage to a city in western Spain which claimed to possess the relics of St. James, the apostle of Jesus. But how had this remote Spanish village obtained such a prized possession? The Acts of the Apostles tell us that James was beheaded in Jerusalem by King Herod Agrippa. It's the only martyrdom of one of the 12 mentioned in the Scriptures. Pious legend recounts that between Pentecost and his return to Jerusalem at the moment of the Herodian persecution of the Palestinian church, St. James preached the gospel to the pagan settlements of the Iberian Peninsula. More about that later. Now let's survey what else the Bible tells us about James the Greater, so called to distinguish him from the other James, James of Alphaeus, James the Less, so called because he was probably younger or smaller in stature than our James. James, the son of Zebedee, appears in all the lists of the 12 apostles in the Gospels of St. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and in the Acts of the Apostles. Interestingly, the fourth gospel, usually attributed to his brother John, makes no mention by name of either of the sons of Zebedee. The single verse in Acts 12 that tells us of James's martyrdom is also notable as the only biblical mention of the apostle that does not also mention his younger brother John. In fact, the two sons of Zebedee are almost always mentioned in conjunction with St. Peter and sometimes with Peter's brother Andrew. The Synoptic Gospels relate that these two pairs of brothers had been business associates in the fishing village of Capernaum on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus called them from their boats and nets to be fishers of men, a call we're told that they accepted immediately. And then Peter, James, and John became a kind of inner circle among the disciples of Jesus. These three alone witness two of Jesus' miraculous healings, that of Simon's mother-in-law and of the daughter of Jairus. And they were also present at three other remarkably intimate moments in the ministry of Jesus: the Transfiguration, an intimate discussion on the Mount of Olives in which Jesus warns them about coming tribulations and the sign of the end times, and in the Garden of Gethsemane, in which Peter, James, and John are close enough to experience the agony of Jesus. There, the three also became a powerful sign of the general failure of all the disciples when they could not stay awake even 1 hour in prayer with their distressed teacher. There are two stories in the Gospels which feature James and John independently of Peter and Andrew, and both stories present the brothers in a somewhat negative light. Although in fairness, both stories also represent their zeal for the mission of Jesus. So as St. Mark tells the first story, James and John asked Jesus to give them places of honor when he had established his kingdom. The ambition of these two brothers irritated the other 10 disciples, but Jesus does not castigate them. He uses the occasion to teach them and the other disciples that leadership in his kingdom will not be about political power or position, but rather about humility and service. Curiously, in St. Matthew's version of this story, the request comes not from the brothers, but from their mother, whom Matthew will also name among the women followers of Jesus who witnessed the crucifixion after all his male disciples had abandoned him. The other unflattering story about James and John is recounted by St. Luke. As Jesus and his disciples passed through Samaritan territory on their way to Jerusalem, they were refused hospitality in a Samaritan town. James and John asked Jesus if they should call down fire from heaven to consume the Samaritans. This did earn Jesus' rebuke, and perhaps explain why, as St. Mark tells us, Jesus gave them the nickname Boanerges, or sons of thunder. The Acts of the Apostles mentions St. James only twice in the list of the 11 and in the aforementioned text about his martyrdom. I also mentioned before that tradition tells us that after the dispersion of the church, St. James preached the gospel in Roman Hispania. Another ancient tradition tells us that when James was discouraged that only 7 Iberians had converted to Christianity after several years of preaching, he received consolation from a miraculous visit of the Blessed Virgin Mary. She appeared to him on the banks of the river Ebro at the Roman settlement of Caesar Augusta, standing on a pillar surrounded by angels. After encouraging him to keep preaching, she disappeared, leaving the pillar behind. This relic is honored in the Basilica of Nuestra Señora de Pilar, or Our Lady of the Pillar, in Zaragoza to this day. Sometime later, James returned to Jerusalem where he was martyred. According to tradition, his body was borne by his disciples in a divinely guided, rudderless boat to the shores of the Iberian Peninsula, and there, in the place where he preached the gospel, his disciples buried his body. For 8 centuries, the location of his relics was forgotten. In 813, a hermit named Pelayo discovered them when a miraculous star pointed him to the place where they lay hidden. The publication throughout Christendom of their discovery brought many visitors to pray in their presence, and a cathedral was built over the burial place. The city of Santiago de Compostela grew up in that place, and quickly the Camino de Santiago, the way of St. James, would become one of the most traveled pilgrimage routes in all the world, rivaled only by those to Rome and to the Holy Land. In 2015, 4 decades after first reading about Santiago in the World Book Encyclopedia, I fulfilled a nearly lifelong dream of walking the Camino de Santiago. I thought of it as a journey to visit a friend of the family after whom I had been named. Along the 500-plus mile journey, which began for me at Lourdes, I reflected on the stories about St. James from the scriptures and from the traditions of the church. I was inspired by the stories of his vocation, his ambition, his enthusiasm, his friendship with Jesus, his discouragement at failure, and the inspiration his life provided generations of pilgrims before me. In the end, I believe this is the point of studying what we can know about our early Christian ancestors. Their strengths and weaknesses are the same as ours, and their faithfulness and perseverance should encourage us to those same virtues. When, after 44 days of walking, I arrived in Santiago de Compostela, I knelt at the tomb of my namesake, proud to have borne his name, grateful for his life and witness, and deeply desirous of his patronage. Brothers and sisters, keep studying. This is Father Bart, James Hutcherson, for the Western Dominican Province.
You've been watching Truth in 60. For more exclusive videos, download the OPwest app. Link is in the description.